The bitter odor of corpses is peculiar to Schopenhauer. Without Schopenhauer, there would be no Nietzsche. When he was 30 years old, he wrote an essay called Schopenhauer as Educator, in which he wrote the following: I belong to those readers of Schopenhauer who know perfectly well, after they have turned the first page, that they will read all the others, and listen to every word he has spoken. My trust in him sprang to life at once, and has been the same for 9 years. It's fair to say that perhaps no one, except for maybe Richard Wagner, knew Schopenhauer as well as Nietzsche did. He studied Schopenhauer deeply, read every word he had ever written, and counted himself among his disciples. The joy of living on this earth is increased by the existence of such a man. If I had the task of making myself at home on the earth, I would choose him as my companion. However, Nietzsche completely and utterly went against Schopenhauer in the final years of his intellectual career. He went from one of his biggest fans to one of his greatest critics. So much so that, for the longest time, Schopenhauer was only known by the general public by virtue of being attacked by Nietzsche. 15 years after the wonderful words of praise we just quoted, Nietzsche penned down the following: One should not merely deny life with the world as will and representation, as Schopenhauer did. One should, in the first place, deny Schopenhauer. So, what changed? What caused this change of heart? In order to answer this question, we need to dig deep into the very core of Nietzsche's philosophy. Not only that, we must also ask ourselves one of the most fundamental questions of all. What is the value of life? Nietzsche's fundamental disagreement with Schopenhauer lies in the answer to this question. More than just a theoretical question, the question ultimately determines our attitude towards life. Your answer to this question determines whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, whether you affirm life or deny life. If you know just a little bit about Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, you can guess where they stand on this question. But what is more insightful is figuring out exactly why these two great philosophers answered this fundamental question differently, and why Nietzsche changed his mind on it. What Nietzsche and Schopenhauer both agree on, however, is the importance of venturing outside of philosophy into science. Brilliant, today's sponsor, can get you up to speed as well. Brilliant offers interactive, hands-on lessons in math, science, and computer science. They have an interactive teaching method that focuses on solving problems instead of just memorizing stuff. Of particular interest to any student of philosophy are their 2 courses on logic, the foundation of philosophy, and a great way to train your critical thinking skills. Even if you already have a firm grasp of logic, going through these courses is a great way to refresh your memory and give your mind a workout. And if you're new, Brilliant has great explanations and animations for every problem they present to you, so you can learn more efficiently. You solve interactive exercises which are not only fun, but also help you immensely with visualization and memory. Join the millions of people already learning on Brilliant with a special offer just for viewers of the channel. Head to brilliant.org/Weltgeist to get started for free with Brilliant's interactive lessons. The first 200 viewers will also get 20% off an annual membership. Thank you to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Back to the video, we were looking at the question, what is the value of life? In order to determine why Nietzsche chose to break with his former idol Schopenhauer. The best place to look if you want to answer this question is a passage in Twilight of the Idols, the same book in which he wrote we should deny Schopenhauer. In all ages, the wisest have always agreed in their judgment of life. It is no good. At all times and places, the same words have been on their lips, words full of doubt, full of melancholy, full of weariness of life, full of hostility to life. Nietzsche is here referring to a consensus in the Western philosophical tradition that assigns a negative value to life. He gives the example of the famous dying words of Socrates. He instructed his friend to prepare a sacrificial hen for the god Asclepius. Crito, we ought to offer a hen to Asclepius. See to it and don't forget. Nietzsche interprets these famous last words as Socrates saying in a witty way that life is a disease, and that death will cure him of it. For him who has ears, this ludicrous and terrible last word implies, "O Crito, life is a long sickness." Is it possible a man like him, who had lived cheerfully and to all appearance as a soldier, was a pessimist? As we've seen in another video, where we tackled Nietzsche's problem with Socrates in more detail, This was for Nietzsche the beginning of a long tradition of decadence in the Western philosophical tradition. Socrates, who was in many ways the progenitor of all subsequent philosophy, argued that life was a sickness and death was a cure. This pessimistic outlook permeated throughout history ever since. At least, that's how Nietzsche saw it. It was so obvious to him that he coined a Latin phrase, consensus sapientium, agreement of the wise, to illustrate the pervasiveness of this pessimism in philosophy. Pessimism in this context is about assigning a negative value to life, more specifically the life in the here and now on planet Earth, the material world. It's an important distinction because generally philosophical pessimism goes hand in hand with the belief in a so-called Hinterwelt, a beyond world that exists outside of space and time, a metaphysical realm that is the real object of importance, to the detriment of the material world. Wherever Nietzsche finds pessimism, he also finds the belief in a Hinterwelt. In one way or another, these philosophers speak of worlds beyond our own, where things are good. The Hinterwelt takes many forms, and generally, but simplified, in Nietzsche's conception of philosophical history, its development goes like this. First, Plato invents his highly influential theory of forms. He posits the existence of a world of ideas. The material world, Plato argues, is only real insofar as material objects participate in the idea. Allegorically, the material world is merely a shadow, not as real and given as we would naively believe. The only real thing, the true object of philosophical investigation, is the idea, which exists not in our material reality, but elsewhere, in the world of forms. Over time, this theory of Plato develops into Christianity. Here too, belief in a beyond world takes center stage. In the Christian worldview, this temporal existence is merely preparation for the afterlife. The material world is of marginal importance compared to heaven or the kingdom of God. This Christian worldview dominated Western philosophy until the advent of modern philosophy with Descartes. Descartes' rationalism was opposed by Hume's empiricism, and ultimately this led to Kant's transcendental idealism, which sought to reconcile Hume and Descartes. In doing so, Kant introduced the concept of the Ding an sich, or the thing in itself. In the transcendental idealist framework, this thing is the world as it is without the interference of our perception of it. But aside from knowing that there does exist such a thing in itself, we can say nothing more definite about it. The point is that Kant too created, quote-unquote, a new world, one beyond our ordinary material world. And this world too is to be the object of true philosophical or metaphysical knowledge. Only this time, Kant concedes that we cannot know anything about it, and that therefore true metaphysics is impossible. And now, finally, Schopenhauer steps onto the scene, the last German who is to be reckoned with. Schopenhauer imports Kant's idealist framework, and thereby implicitly all historical developments before it, and he adds to the equation his concept of the will. Going against Kant, Schopenhauer argues that metaphysical knowledge is possible after all, because there exists something like the will, which we humans can directly experience without interference of the senses. All of this to say that Schopenhauer too believes in a Hinterwelt. The will is a totally different thing than the material world, and the will, being the metaphysical substrate of reality, is the true object of importance. We've covered this Nietzschean view of history in more depth in a video entitled How the Real World Became a Myth. We'll leave a link to that video in the description if you're interested. So we see how through every important period in philosophical history, from Plato to Christianity to Kant and Schopenhauer, we see a belief in a beyond world and a subsequent dethroning, even distrust, of the material world. This is what Nietzsche means when he says there is a consensus sapientium, an agreement among the wise. The agreement among them is that this life, in our material world and our temporal existence, must not be worth much if this material world isn't all that important. But Nietzsche asks the critical question, what does that prove? What does it point to? Formerly, people would have said, oh, it has been said, and loudly enough too, by our pessimists, loudest of all. In any case, there must be some truth in this. The consensus sapientium is a proof of truth. But of course, just because people agree on something doesn't mean they are right. That consensus sapientium, as I perceived ever more and more clearly, did not in the least prove that they were right in the manner on which they agreed. Nietzsche makes the provocative case that perhaps this agreement among the wise doesn't point to a universal truth, but rather that it points to the fact that all the wise were alike in some physiological manner. In other words, he argues that, perhaps, all the wise of ages past were not actually wise, but sick, that they were decadents. Is it possible that they were, every one of them, a little shaky on their legs, effete, rocky, decadent? Does wisdom perhaps appear on earth after the manner of a crow attracted by a slight smell of carrion? If you are acquainted with Nietzsche, this is a familiar argument. Frequently, Nietzsche will not argue against philosophers on the merits of their arguments taken in a vacuum, but he will consider their positions as revealing something about their psychology. A philosophical argument, or even an opinion, is not arrived at by objective investigation, even though every philosopher, of course, would like to think of himself as being objective and unbiased. But Nietzsche's assertion is that the personality or the psychology of the philosopher plays a pivotal part in the formation of his worldview. By the way, this is the true meaning of the Nietzschean term perspectivism, which is thrown around a lot and is frequently misunderstood or confused with relativism, as if Nietzsche believed that every philosophical opinion is equal to the next, simply because he's also skeptical regarding the existence of objective truth. He simply argued that a philosopher's personality plays a big part in the formation of his arguments. Still, the question we are talking about here, what is the value of life, is in a league of its own. The question is unique because Nietzsche believes that an objective answer to this question is in fact impossible. There is no way to answer this question without bias, because by virtue of being alive, we lose the cold, detached perspective that would underpin an objective investigation. Try to grasp this astonishingly subtle axiom that the value of life cannot be estimated. A living man cannot do so, because he is a contending party, or rather the very object in the dispute, and not a judge. Nor can a dead man estimate it, for other reasons. Therefore, Nietzsche says, whether someone is pessimistic or not is not really a question of his knowledge about the world and about life, but rather it's a symptom of an underlying personality or psychology. The answer to the question, what is the meaning of life, doesn't say anything about life itself, but it says everything about the person who utters it. So now, the great question Nietzsche asks himself is this: what does it say about someone when they deny that life has any value? Is the problem with life, or is the problem with them? For a philosopher to see a problem in the value of life is almost an objection against him, a note of interrogation set against his wisdom, a lack of wisdom. What? Is it possible that all these great sages were not only decadents, but that they were not even wise? This is Nietzsche's great accusation against the Western philosophical tradition since the time of Socrates. The wise do not agree because they found the truth. The wise agree because they all suffered from the same disease, décadence. With this realization of Nietzsche, the insight that the question on the value of life is not a matter of knowledge, but a matter of sickness and health, everything changes. In this realization, we find the key to unlock Nietzsche's philosophy. Master and slave morality, the weak versus the strong, the Übermensch and the last man, ressentiment, even the eternal recurrence. All these ideas and concepts can be traced back to this moment of clarity in which Nietzsche figured out that a certain disease took hold of Western philosophy. We dive deeper into this topic in a video called How Nietzsche Took on the World. It's one of the more important videos on the channel, and if this interests you at all, we highly recommend you check it out. We'll leave a link in the description. So let's backtrack a bit and return to the question at hand. Why did Nietzsche change his mind on Schopenhauer? His admiration for Schopenhauer vanished once he grasped this notion of décadence. He began to see all of Western philosophy, ever since the time of Socrates, through this lens, and Schopenhauer was the final, most pronounced victim of this disease. Decadence takes root in weak people, people who cannot handle the harsh realities of life. This incapability of dealing with suffering manifests itself in the foremost symptom of décadence, a flight into a beyond world away from the material world. Wherever a Hinterwelt is found, there we also find décadence. Where we find décadence, we find weakness. And Nietzsche abhorred weakness. His philosophy is a call to action, to see the world as it is, deal with its harsh realities, and not seek a refuge in a world beyond. Schopenhauer posited the existence of the will, a metaphysical dimension which takes the place of what Kant called the thing an sich, or the thing in itself. We will not go over Schopenhauer's entire philosophy in this video, but we have a 40-minute video on the channel covering his work in depth. Check it out by clicking the link in the description. But up until now, we only have a general outline of why Nietzsche came to change his mind on Schopenhauer. Other Hinterwelt philosophies regard the material world with suspicion at worst, or say that it's simply not as important as the Hinterwelt at best. But Schopenhauer takes this one step further in a way that would completely rub Nietzsche the wrong way. What do we mean by this? In Plato's philosophy, the material world is simply a shadow of the world of ideas. In Christianity, this world is a preparation for the next. For Kant, this world is simply a world of appearance. The material world, in these three philosophies, is either an obstacle or a distraction. But for Schopenhauer, the material world is a place of suffering. Now, obviously, Plato, Christianity, and Kant do not deny that suffering exists in the material world. But there is a major difference. For Schopenhauer, suffering is not simply an accidental feature of the material world, but it's an integral, essential part of it. The material world cannot exist without suffering. It's metaphysically impossible. Suffering takes central stage in Schopenhauer's philosophy in a way that's simply not there in Plato and Kant. Christianity is a bit of an exception. Suffering is very important in Christian theology, but suffering is not an essential part of the world as it is in Schopenhauer. In Christian theology, suffering entered the world when Adam and Eve disobeyed God and ate the fruit in the Garden of Eden. The world was a paradise, free of suffering actually, before Adam and Eve introduced pain and want and suffering to it. In Schopenhauer's philosophy, suffering is an essential part of the material world right from the beginning. Why is this? Schopenhauer's will, if you remember, exists outside of time and space. If the will is spaceless and timeless, then it follows that the will is undifferentiated in time and space. What does this mean? To use a metaphor, it means that the will is one. In the domain of the will, there are no different things. Multiplicity, the existence of multiple things, is not applicable to the will because multiplicity requires a spatial element. To distinguish one object from another, you need these two objects to occupy a different space. But because the will is not the kind of thing that has space, it follows that the will is undifferentiated and therefore one. What this means is that beyond the illusory world of representation, beyond the world as we ordinarily experience it, there is no you or me, no here or there, no this, no that. There is just will and nothing else. In the domain of the will, that is to say, on the deepest, most fundamental level, all of existence is one big whole. Now, why is there suffering in the world? Because there is multiplicity instead of unity. The world as a representation, which comes into existence with the perceiving subject, divides the unified world of the will into the categories of object and subject and time and space and causality. In the domain of the will, there are no different things, and therefore no conflicts. Because where would the conflicts be? There is simply will and nothing else. It's only in the representation, that is to say, in the world of our experience, that conflict can arise, because now there is you versus me, wolf versus rabbit, hunter versus prey. And the most fundamental conflict there is object versus subject, you versus the world. And differentiation is exactly what distinguishes the world of representation, the material world, from the world as will. The material world, in Schopenhauer's philosophy, cannot be anything other than a place of suffering, because in its differentiation, in its dividing things between themselves, it disturbs the fundamental unity of the will. It creates conflict where formerly there was none. Suffering is therefore an integral part of the material world. Leibniz famously held the philosophical position that we live in the best of all possible worlds. Schopenhauer made the reply that, no, we actually live in the worst of all possible worlds. This was not a cheap quip or a simple inversion of what Leibniz was saying. It was a profound statement on the nature of our reality, backed up by Schopenhauer's entire system of metaphysics. This is also why Schopenhauer's philosophy is much more pessimistic than most people realize. He's not a pessimist in the sense that he thinks there is more suffering than joy in the world, although, to be sure, he certainly does think that. But his pessimism is much more profound. Schopenhauer seriously argues that this world, if it were even a tiny bit better, if the will would be a tiny bit less divided against itself, would cease to exist. To put it more poetically, every drop in the ocean, every blade of grass, every molecule, every atom is imbued with suffering. His philosophy is not simply saying that the material world is a shadow, as in Plato, nor is he saying that this world is a mere preparation for the next, as in Christianity. He doesn't even say that this world is simply appearance, as in Kant. He says that this world is a hell, that it is built on suffering and can only exist because of suffering. This intense dislike of the material world is what sets Schopenhauer apart from the other Hinterwelt philosophies, and it's why Nietzsche singled out Schopenhauer as the most nihilistic of these philosophers. Because if this world is such a hell, then what should we do? Schopenhauer argued for an ascetic lifestyle, which is a fancy way of saying a removal from the material world. So he ends up expressing admiration for ascetic monks, people who do nothing but fast all day, meditate and pray, abstain from sex, and sometimes even hurt themselves, all to distance themselves from the material world. To be sure, these ascetic practices also exist in the major world religions, including Christianity. But at least in Christianity, there is hope. There is heaven waiting for the pious. For Schopenhauer, there is no redemption. The best we can do is mortify the will as much as possible until we die a peaceful death. And that's it. So Schopenhauer ends up recommending the type of hard, strenuous lifestyle lived by the strictest adherents of Christianity and Buddhism, but without the prospect of heaven or nirvana. From Nietzsche's perspective, he takes the most nihilistic extremes of religion and strips away the tiny little thing these religions have going for them: hope. Schopenhauer's intense dislike of the material world is what attracts Nietzsche's most vehement critiques. For Nietzsche, Schopenhauer is not merely sick with decadence, he is already dead. Hence, in his later works, we see these references to death when Nietzsche talks about Schopenhauer. In Ecce Homo, for example, he says Schopenhauer's philosophy has the air of a rotting corpse, and that a refutation of his philosophy is not even needed, but that all you do need is a good sense of smell to know that something is rotten. By advocating a complete withdrawal from the world by way of asceticism, Schopenhauer did the complete and utter opposite of what Nietzsche's later philosophy would come to be about: growth, self-overcoming, willingly embracing suffering, and loving your life in this world so much that you would do it all over again for all eternity. Schopenhauer's embrace of asceticism is for Nietzsche only a symptom and not a serious philosophical position. It's a symptom born from the disease of decadence, which itself stems from weakness and an inability to deal with the material world, to face reality with determination and say, bring it on. Schopenhauer is too weak for this, and instead of dealing with the world as it presents itself, he advocates for a lifestyle that is all about avoiding life and avoiding the world. No food, no sex, only prayer and meditation, only the quiet life of the monk. While Nietzsche wants us to embrace the harsh realities of the world, to overcome ourselves, to struggle, to grow. Life for Nietzsche is all about venting strength and power. Schopenhauer wants us to step away from the world. Nietzsche wants us to jump in. And not just be in the world like everyone else is, but jump in such a way that we must joyfully embrace every single moment, even during times of great strife and struggle and suffering. This is the main point of Amor Fati and the Eternal Return. They're ways for Nietzsche to communicate just how strongly he wants us to participate in the world, and in large part, these concepts arise out of opposition to Schopenhauer. Asceticism is only one part of Schopenhauer's ethical equation. He very well realizes that this ascetic lifestyle, the quiet, contemplative life of the monk, is not attainable for the great mass of men. In fact, he thinks his ascetic ideal is so unattainable, he only lists a handful of historical examples, figures like Jesus Christ, the Buddha, and Saint Francis of Assisi. So what is the regular man to do? The best as mere mortals can hope for, according to Schopenhauer, is to be compassionate and behave in an altruistic manner, sacrificing ourselves for our fellow humans. This might not sound particularly profound. After all, almost every system of ethics agrees that being selfless and helping others is good, and that being selfish and hurting others is bad. But that's precisely the point. Schopenhauer considered it one of his greatest achievements, that he found a solid philosophical foundation for an ethics that has been around for millennia through the major world religions. To him, it signified that his philosophy was correct. These major religions, who have been around for ages, each spoke to something in the human experience. They articulated, in religious language, something that is intuitively present in all of mankind. All he did, says Schopenhauer, is translate these feelings in a philosophical language instead of a religious one, and therefore provide a solid, logical, rational basis for an ethics that had up until this point not found such a basis. Even Kant had to eventually reintroduce the concept of God in order to make his ethics coherent. The philosophical basis for his ethics is firmly rooted in metaphysics. Remember how we said that the will is undifferentiated in space, that the will is one. Well then, logically, it follows that there is no real meaningful distinction between humans. In the domain of the will, that is to say, the world of real importance, there is no you and me. We are all will. We are all one. To realize this fundamental unity means to accept the responsibility that in hurting others, we actually hurt ourselves. And by helping others, we help ourselves. Because other people are ourselves. Egoism is therefore one of the greatest evils in Schopenhauer's system, because it contradicts the core of his metaphysics. The egoist behaves in such a way as if only he himself existed in the world, divorced from other humans. But this is not true in a metaphysical sense. Schopenhauer expresses it poetically. The hungry wolf buries its fangs in the flesh of its prey, without the possibility of the knowledge that it is itself to destroy it, as well as the destroyer. The wolf, by devouring its prey, is actually hurting itself as much as it hurts the prey. The same holds true for humans, except that, as opposed to wolves, we do have some innate realization of how bad it is to hurt other people. What is this innate realization? We call it compassion. The feeling we have when we see other humans in pain. The fact that this feeling exists at all is for Schopenhauer the first clue as to the fundamental inner workings of the world. We feel the way we feel because on some level, even though we cannot always verbalize it, we identify ourselves with the other person. But without Schopenhauer's theory of the unity of the will, the idea that we are all one, this feeling of identification doesn't make any sense. This is why Schopenhauer says that all ethics begins with compassion, and it flows directly from his metaphysics. Again, he explains in philosophical terms an idea that has been present in humans before, but only in religious terms. Compassion and the conscience, the little voice in your head that makes you feel bad when you hurt someone else, used to be explained as the voice of God. Schopenhauer takes this religious article of faith and puts it in secular philosophical language. You feel bad when hurting others because fundamentally, deep down, you realize that you are hurting yourself. And why does it feel good to help others? Well, because you are helping yourself. So Schopenhauer bases his entire system of ethics around this feeling of compassion, which is itself only an expression of his metaphysics. The ethics based on compassion is for Nietzsche another battlefield on which he will wage war. Nietzsche spends considerable time attacking compassion, or pity as he calls it, most notably in the Antichrists. Pity is opposed to the tonic passions which enhance the energy of the feeling of life. Its action is depressing. A man loses power when he pities. By means of pity, the drain on strength, which suffering itself already introduces into the world, is multiplied 1,000-fold. Through pity, suffering itself becomes infectious. In certain circumstances, it may lead to a total loss of life and vital energy. The problem with pity is that it preserves that which is ripe for destruction. It fights in favor of the disinherited and the condemned of life, thanks to the multitude of failures of all kinds which it maintains in life. It lends life itself a somber and questionable aspect. Pity, according to Nietzsche, is anti-life, and every morality that finds its basis in pity, such as Schopenhauer's ethics or Christianity for that matter, must therefore be anti-life as well. People exalted pity to the virtue, the root and origin of all virtues. But, of course, what must never be forgotten is the fact that this was done from the standpoint of a philosophy which was nihilistic, and on whose shield the device, the denial of life, was inscribed. Schopenhauer was right in this respect. By means of pity, life is denied and made more worthy of denial. Pity is the praxis of nihilism. This leaves one question left unanswered, the question of nihilism. Because even if we agree with Nietzsche's diagnosis of Western philosophy and culture, even if we assume his critiques of Schopenhauer are valid, even if we say that morality somewhere took a completely wrong turn and we're on the wrong path towards degeneration and decadence, the question still remains, so what? Nietzsche saw mankind heading towards nihilism, towards a loss of meaning that would destroy all greatness and all the potential for greatness in man and culture. In the previous quote, Nietzsche called pity the praxis of nihilism. But it's not just pity, it's everything pity represents. The story started with Plato and his theory of forms some 2500 years ago, and it culminated in the life-denying philosophy of Schopenhauer. Throughout these 2500 years, philosophy changed, but the underlying idea has always been that, metaphysically, there is a Hinterwelt, and ethically, we should base our morality on compassion. Nietzsche asks himself, where have these ideas brought us? And his answer is that it has brought us nihilism. What is nihilistic about a Hinterwelt and a morality based on compassion? Taken at face value, nothing is nihilistic about these things. The problem is that gradually we have lost faith in these Hinterwelts. We have lost faith in the existence of a beyond world that exists somewhere outside of space and time. The most dominant form of the Hinterwelt used to be God. But rapid advancements in the natural sciences, picking up an extraordinary pace in Nietzsche's time, have made such belief superfluous. The Hinterwelt is fading away. God is dying. You might say, God is dead. God is dead, and we have killed him. The implications of this greatest historical event, as Nietzsche called it, go far beyond Schopenhauer. If you are interested, we've tackled the subject in great depth in our video on the joyful science, in which the famous passage of the death of God appears. On the implications for morality, we've done a well-received video on Nietzsche's warning to scientists about how morality will become a problem for them in the post-death of God age. Check it out if you're interested. The point of this section is to highlight that Nietzsche goes against Schopenhauer because he saw Schopenhauer's philosophy as the herald of nihilism. The last will of man, his will for nothingness, nihilism, and, in sooth, the way is well paved thereto. Nietzsche's entire philosophy can be viewed as one big warning against this looming prospect of nihilism, against this last will into nothingness, against this disease that destroys everything lofty and great. And he tried to take the first steps to provide an alternative to nihilism, to provide a philosophy of the future. This is where concepts like the Übermensch, Amor Fati, and the eternal recurrence come in. But most of all, Nietzsche wanted to replace man's will to nothingness with a will to power, his antidote to the destructive, ironically named will to life, the main concept in Schopenhauer's philosophy. And it starts with a transvaluation of all values, and chiefly a revaluation of the value of life, which is, in the nihilistic agreement of the wise, nothing. Nietzsche wants to make it something. But, as is well known, Nietzsche did not live to complete this work. He refers to the future. The second essay of the genealogy of morals ends with this sentence. But what am I talking of? Enough, enough. At this juncture I have only one proper course. Silence. Otherwise trespass on a domain open alone to one who is younger than I, one stronger, more future than I. Open alone to Zarathustra, Zarathustra the godless. We started this video with a question of why Nietzsche, who initially was one of Schopenhauer's greatest champions, ultimately changed his mind on him. The answer to this question took us on a road throughout the entire history of Western philosophy, the history of the Hinterwelt, as Nietzsche saw it. From Plato to Christianity to Kant and ultimately to Schopenhauer, Nietzsche traced the idea of a beyond world preparing itself and shifting shape. The idea of a Hinterwelt arises when life, that is to say, the life in this material world, the life of the here and now, is assigned a negative value. Nietzsche disagreed with this agreement of the wise. At one point, he realized that this perceived negative value of life was not the result of cold, detached philosophical reasoning, but rather that it was a symptom of a disease he called décadence, which found its root in weakness, in dealing with the harsh realities of life. Schopenhauer was specifically vulnerable to this disease, because for him, the material world is not just an irrelevant or unimportant world that is overshadowed by the Hinterwelt, but his philosophy holds that the material world is built on suffering and could not exist without it. His philosophy then advises us to avoid the world, to mortify the will, and to deny life. In doing so, he takes things a step further than Plato, Christianity, and Kant had done. And it's the source of Nietzsche's incisive metaphors to describe Schopenhauer's philosophy, almost all of which have to do with death and corpses. Schopenhauer's ethics, based on compassion, is exposed by Nietzsche as only multiplying and prolonging the suffering in the world by extending the life of that which is meant to be destroyed. Pity as a glorification of weakness, a glorification of that which is opposed to life. All of this, Nietzsche argued, would ultimately lead to nihilism. And Nietzsche, contrary to popular belief, was not a nihilist. His entire philosophical project is about finding an alternative to nihilism. By attacking Schopenhauer, he tried to pave the way for an alternative philosophy, a philosophy that is not based on the Hinterwelt and a philosophy that is not based on the denial of life. He sought to create a philosophy that could affirm life. That's what the Übermensch is, that's what the eternal return is, and that's what Amor Fati is. Above all, that's what the will to power is. And he tried to set us up for a philosophical future in which this vision could be realized. A vision that runs completely counter to the vision Schopenhauer had for humanity. And that's why Nietzsche hated Schopenhauer. And thank you for watching. This video took a long while to make, so if you liked it, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like and a comment. We appreciate it greatly. A special thanks goes out to our Patreons who keep the channel running and who allow the production of these long videos. If you want to support the work we do, kindly visit the link in the description. Patreons in the higher tiers also get access to a monthly exclusive video. If you want more Nietzsche, we've done in-depth analyses of almost all of his major works, including The Joyful Science and Twilight of the Idols. 2 analyses which you will enjoy if you thought this video was valuable. Again, thank you for watching and we'll see you in the next one.